Henry Kissinger said, if you control the oil, you control nations. But if you control food, you control the people. This was not his own original thought. This is how governments operate. And not Henry Kissinger's government, all governments, but primarily the Anglo-American world empire that exists at this time, of which Henry Kissinger was a very powerful figure. Historically, people were coming to this nation, and I'm not going to delve into the histories of all the world's nations, although they all operate similarly. I'm familiar with the history of the United States because this is where I'm from. But from what I understand, all nations are the same. Historically, people have been coming to this nation for thousands of years, this landmass, the New World. I know you were told in school that all the Native Americans came from Asia by crossing a land bridge into Alaska, and whether or not that even happened, I don't know and don't care and won't argue it. But it is a fact that the first explorers recognized that there were different types of people here. Some looked European, some looked like, the regular look that we associate with Indians, Native Americans. And even though there were skirmishes and things, people basically got along, and no one had ever even considered that one individual or an entity should control the food, not even the land. Land and food belong to the Great Spirit. The land was put here for the people to take care of, and the food was given to individuals by the Great Spirit, and each person was responsible for acquiring, preparing, and storing his own food. Although this was often done in groups just to make it easier and because people loved one another and enjoyed spending time together. However, eventually people came from Europe who were not simply looking for a place to settle down, and that would have been Columbus, Christopher Columbus. He was sent here sponsored by the government. He wasn't just coming to be friends. He was actually sent by the government, and his job was to conquer the New World. So once he set up his base of operations, he began to enslave the native peoples to do physical labor. The people would run away, and so he would have some rounded up and executed, and more people would run away, so he'd round them up and torture them to death, mutilate them, cut their arms off, cut their hands off, their legs off, set them on fire. But it never worked, because the people who lived here lived with the land. So all they had to do was, as soon as someone turned their back, is take off running. If they could get out of the reach of the Europeans, they were free, because as soon as they got to as far as they needed to run, they would stop and eat. They knew every organic thing, every plant, every animal, how to acquire it, how to prepare it, and how to store it. So it was not a big issue for them to escape and be okay. In fact, that's what began the slave trade. Once Europeans realized they couldn't enslave the native populations because of their familiarity with food, they went to Africa and kidnapped families from Africa, broke them up, sold them to different individuals, and put them to work with hard labor. Things were no different. The Africans, as soon as someone turned around or as soon as the chains were off, would take off running. The only difference being, coming from Africa, they were not familiar with the plants of this nation. So that was the first instance of controlling the food to control the people, because they couldn't have controlled them in Africa, but by bringing them here, they were under control. In fact, this lesson wasn't lost to the leaders of our country. Once the Constitution was written, the greatest document to freedom ever written, as argued by many, of course, it's a document written by slave owners, then programs were initiated to bring about a genocide of the native population. So the people were hunted down and killed by whatever means necessary. But after years and years of that, when there were still Indians here on this land, a program was initiated to slaughter their food sources, primarily the buffalo. So the Europeans, the Americans, the American government had all of the buffalo exterminated. People would argue it was food necessary for the people, the Europeans, to live on, but they didn't eat them, they just killed them. Sometimes they would take the pelts because that was a valuable trade commodity, you know, as much as they could fit on a train. They'd go out with a train, kill all the buffalo, load the hides up. Oftentimes they would cut the tongues out, and I don't really understand the concept of that, but tongues were a delicacy, buffalo tongues at that time. But that's not why they killed the buffalo. They killed the buffalo to kill the Indians. Later on, when the Indians still didn't die, they went in and took their land from them and had them march hundreds of miles away. And it was to places where the crops may have, or the plants around them and the animals around them may have been unfamiliar, but mostly the locations where they were marched were chosen because they had no water source, very few animals, and very little vegetation. It was believed that once they marched them there, then the Indians would die. I'm sure there will be people who will argue that they were marched there because there was shiny metal where they lived, and America needed the shiny metal to be powerful. And I'll get the same old that I got on my old YouTube channel, that if I don't like it, I need to get out of America. I don't deserve this wonderful life. But I really believe that the shiny metal had very little to do with it, because the programs that were initiated seemed to be very similar to the previous policy of control the food, control the people. Historically, this is really all the proof you need that that's how governments work. In my next video, I'll discuss modern control the food, control the people methods.